Okay, so quick note before we begin. This video has spoilers within its gameplay, and I'm going to be talking about story elements that are spoilers, so for the moment, you're going to be seeing some random EDZ gameplay while we talk about a few important things just before getting to the meat of it. There will be spoilers again. This is your spoiler warning. Turn off if you're so inclined. So, to the surprise of literally nobody on social media, earlier this month I was out at Bungie, and I played Renegades early. It's actually been a while since I've been to Bungie. The last time was Shadowkeep, so yeah, it's nice to be back. They did pay for my lodging and travel expenses, and I should stress that these opinions are still my own, but I've only seen a vertical slice of Renegades, so this is by no means a complete review. It's also worth noting that this build is subject to change. It is not a final build. I also wanted to simply say before talking about any of this that, well, yeah, I get it. And frankly, every employee I spoke to at Bungie gets it too. The game is not in a good place, and pretending otherwise is ludicrous. Whilst it'd be accurate to say that they're working hard to fix the state of the game, that's no consolation when game development pretty much moves at a glacial pace always. If you're disappointed by the state of Destiny right now, I think it's important that you know that the whole group of people invited out, as well as every developer greeting us at Bungie, were in the same place. Nobody was under any illusion that the game was doing great and that things were fine. Everybody felt the pressure in that room. Actions take time to influence the game, but nobody there needed catching up on the situation at hand. It's not as though they're sitting around with their fingers in their ears. That being said, if I'm to speak to the people who are still playing Destiny and who do want to jump in and play Renegades, I think the most important thing I can tell you from the top of the video is that Renegades represents an improvement to the state that we're in, but not necessarily an enormous one. We've been in pretty bad places with the game before, and in those instances, some expansions have come along and fixed the content of the game, and have done so in a massive sweeping manner. Forsaken and the Taken King come to mind whenever this is going down. However, it should be made really clear that neither in terms of the scale, nor in terms of the problems it fixes, is this Forsaken. As I'll discuss later, I think there's also questions about what happens past the first month or so of the content of Renegades, and how all this pans out from a longevity perspective. This will probably not be some miraculous return to form in the long run like we had with the final shape, where the game was pumping on all cylinders and where everything was near perfect. That might sound like a portent of immediate doom, so I want to also let you know that what I did experience of Renegades was actually a lot of fun, and whilst it doesn't solve all the fundamental problems of the game right now, I think it's worth experiencing on its own merits, both as a Destiny experience and as an homage to Star Wars. The expansion feels like something substantial in the short run, but it also genuinely expands on the universe, introducing new characters, a ton of new narrative elements, and a slew of other bits and pieces to the universe that make the narrative feel like it's expanding in a bunch of different directions. The addition of a pair of wider weapon archetypes with the balanced and dynamic blaster types is a surprisingly large addition all on its own. The Lawless Frontier might not hold everyone's attention forever, but I think it's an important step away from the Portal, and everything wrong with what was introduced in Edge of Fate. There is also, of course, the elephant in the room. This is a Star Wars crossover, and well-intentioned concerns were raised in the community because of this from day one. Honestly, I think that this aspect of Renegade's release was more important than any other pillar of it, more important than the narrative, than the dungeon, than the new weapon archetypes or activities. It was the balance of these two IPs, one of which is iconic and the other of which is Destiny that we know and love. I'll talk more about it later, but personally I think the balance is dialed in relatively well, but I also have to acknowledge that there are bound to be numerous disagreements and numerous opinions on this, and I can tell immediately that there are going to be pain points for some people that might not exist for others. The entire concept for some is going to seem like a mistake in the first place, and for others, it is going to be exactly as was described at the reveal, a bit like peanut butter and chocolate, a great combination, unless you're allergic, like me. This is not a good metaphor, I'm sorry. Point being, it's going to be divisive, but there are going to be people who genuinely love Renegades for what it is, and I think there are also going to be people who will want to sit this one out. The expansion borrows heavily from Star Wars in its visual and audio content, but narratively it's standing on its own 2 feet. You might see a clear throwback to Yoda's hut on Venus, but you'll never hear a little green man saying, "May the Force be with you." For those who didn't mind both universes mixing, this probably means that Renegades will be a ton of fun. For those of you who didn't want any mixing, I don't think this was ever going to be the expansion for you. What I can say is that I don't think this was slop, and I don't think it's representative of Bungie running out of creative energy, as has been stated by at least a few people all over the internet. So given that I was at this event, what content can you expect out of me? Good question. I'm sure you'll also be able to see that there are a ton of other creators out there who are releasing their own content right now too. They also traveled to Bungie for the preview event, and if you want something that's more PvE or exotic or PvP focused, you know where to go for that. The narrative is where the majority of my content is going to really reside. First things first, for all things narrative, I have to say that I'm allowed to talk about very, very little. Needless to say, Bungie doesn't want your story experience to be spoiled, and neither do I. I am, however, allowed to show the full first story mission outside of cutscenes, which you'll be able to find on the channel as a separate video. I also have an interview with the wonderful Alison Lurs, the narrative team's narrative director, and that's going up at some point soon as well. We talked about the story and lore of Renegades, what it was like making a Star Wars crossover, and how they avoided the potential nightmare scenario and pitfalls that this expansion faced narratively. Major spoilers from a moment on from here. If you want to go in totally blind, I would recommend switching off now. Anyway, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Lawless Frontier. We'll talk about the Star Wars crossover elements and how they've been handled, the campaign and what I've seen of it thus far, the Lawless Frontier, invasions, the Praxic Blade aka Destiny's lightsaber, the new blaster archetypes, the additions to the rest of the game, and the general state of Destiny with the release of Renegades and where we're likely to be. So, starting off with the crossover elements of the entire expansion, and whether it's too much Star Wars and not enough Destiny. As I said at the top, this will be a different measure for just about every person. There is no question, the fact that there is Star Wars in your Destiny was probably going to be something that turned off at least a few people, no matter how much of Star Wars was already in Destiny, including Stormcallers or the fact that people with guns decided to use swords that can block projectiles. Renegades borrows a lot of the visual aesthetic and motifs of Star Wars directly instead of as inspiration, and they're also using a lot of really iconic sounds in this expansion. But Bungie also deliberately made the decision to set it apart from Star Wars and pull back the balance towards Destiny in other areas. Some examples of this clearly stick out as veering more towards one side than the other more frequently. The keen examples for me at very least are things like the DL-44 blaster and the Praxic Blade and the pre-order skins. Yeah, the pre-order skins I think are the most egregious example of imbalances towards Star Wars. They are actual Star Wars characters, not Destiny skins that have a Star Wars twist on them. No, you can just full-on be Darth Vader. And I'm going to be completely honest, I think that is the thing that stands out like a sore thumb. All the characters within Renegades are their own thing. None of them have any references to Star Wars even if they're following Star Wars archetypes. So you can have a cast of completely bespoke Destiny characters, some of which have lore that goes back multiple years, and then in the middle of all of it you have the Guardian who just looks like General Grievous. That doesn't sit right with me because unlike something like, say, a Praxic Blade, there is a lot of story context to a character like General Grievous, or Darth Vader, or Kylo Ren, and immediately inserting them one-to-one in Destiny, that just doesn't feel right to me. Putting aside all the pre-order stuff though, for what it's worth if you are looking for Star Wars in Destiny, the approach that Bungie's taken means that they've really hit home on the kind of aesthetic and vibes of a lot of Star Wars locations, whilst keeping a fair amount of Destiny in there. I think the best example of what I saw for this was probably the Cabal ship from the first campaign mission, the Zagan Gloriosus. It looks like it's used the exact design documents from the Death Star across all of Episode 4, and it's really awesome to see how it's all manifested in this particular manner. This is something which isn't immediately integral to Star Wars, like say a character being Darth Vader, but it does also mean that it can manifest in other universes and still clearly stand out as something that is Star Wars-esque. It has the visual language, but if you look close enough, there are still elements of Destiny that you recognize. The Cabal palette is still being used, so all the Cabal crates, explosives, containers, cylinders, all that stuff is still there, and it means that there is this weird merge of the two, but I don't think it's necessarily an uncomfortable weird, especially when the thematic elements tie together very well. The Cabal are an empire. The Barrent Imperium is called an Imperium. The Galactic Empire is also an empire. You know, all of the thematics of things meld together well here. There are moments, however, where Renegades veers firmly back towards the Destiny side of that balance, and I think the chief example here probably comes with the new hub destination, Tharsis Junction. I think this is where the happy fusion of the two IPs feels most at home. This is for the better as well, given that it feels like a hub that could exist within Destiny without Renegades even existing at all. And it's a development of a major location within the Destiny universe. Tharsis Junction in particular has been on Mars for years, and we've been there back in Destiny 1. It's also a kind of place where you're going to be on a semi-regular basis between missions. You see a lot of Tharsis Junction, so it makes a natural amount of sense for you to be able to jump into Tharsis and then feel at home in Destiny. But for those of you who are worried about things getting a little heavy-handed, there are some bits that will stand out more than others. Some bits are alright, such as the Europa equivalent of Hoth having a massive Cabal version of the Ion Cannon, or the swampier area of Venus, which has Destiny's version of Luke's crashed X-Wing and Yoda's hovel. These are clear throwbacks, and you'll be able to identify them without much trouble, but they also don't feel so completely impossible within Destiny's universe that they're jarring to some crazy extent. I'd say that the trash compactor on the first level is a little bit of an overreach, but also we saw a trash compactor just like this on Presage years ago, and people didn't complain about it back then, so yeah, I don't know, that particular complaint feels like it rings a little hollow. The bit that does read as a bit too far for me is the Drifter being frozen Han Solo Carbonite style in a block of ice. Well, it's stasis, but you get the point. To some, this is going to be a fun throwback to Episode 5 and Episode 6, but to others, this is way too on the nose. I'm sure for some people this alone is going to upset the balance and will be less carbonite and more kryptonite. As a general point, I think the elements that can be used within the sandbox are actually all bits that I'm willing to give a pass to as well. The Barrent Imperiums, Bipedal Walkers, the Praxic Blade aka Lightsaber, the Blaster archetypes. You get to use these and you actually see them in action within Destiny's sandbox, and for that alone, it makes things feel a lot more tolerable, because much as we often forget, Destiny is a game that's got really tight weapon feel, and much as balance is often something that Bungie gets wrong, they still kill it with weapon design. Blasters, Praxic Blade, and the big walkers included. I'll talk about this more in another section, but the fact that it feels as good as it does to wield the blasters and use the Praxic Blade makes it feel more immersive within the experience, because they meet the quality bar of Destiny's gunplay that we all just kind of expect and is often met like an invisible quality to things. Sure, some things will be imbalanced, but rarely does a gun in Destiny's sandbox feel bad to shoot. That's what really makes all this so potent. You can recognize the visuals of these weapons, and most of them are using authentic Star Wars sounds with maybe a few close twists here and there. Because of that, and because of the guns generally being as tight as they are in terms of their performance in Destiny, Bungie's blasters feel better than most blasters in most other Star Wars games out there, and tight gunplay is unquestionably a Destiny thing, so it doesn't feel out of place. Shifting over to the narrative side of the balance discussion, another really big thing pointed out by Alison Lures in both the Vidoc and our interview was that there was a specific choice within the narrative team to follow archetypes of Star Wars characters for inspiration, but to let Destiny's parts of it all shine through. Most importantly, very early on, she and the narrative team at large made the decision, and what I think is the most sensible call of the entire expansion, to simply never drop a Star Wars quote in the dialogue of this expansion. It might seem odd given how many quotes Star Wars has within it, and how iconic some of them are, but honestly, this was absolutely the right call. Nothing would have been worse than hammy writing in this, when it's trying to also tell some of the story beats that it is, and you know, when it goes wrong, you can tell how it goes wrong. For an example of this being done wrong, take a look at another franchise where this has happened recently. In particular, a franchise I love, Alien, and one of the recent entries within the IP, Alien Romulus. I love that movie. I actually really think that it's up there with some of the better Alien films. But for me, there is a moment where things do fall flat. If you're going to take one of Ripley's iconic lines, you better make it count, and you better not invoke it lightly. But I fear that they kind of did do that within the movie. You won't need to worry about that here in Renegades though. It was actively understood and avoided from the beginning. As a result, as all the characters go through the campaign, nothing ever really feels forced. That pun wasn't intended when writing this script, but for context and comparison, everything I saw of Renegade's campaign was less referential than even that accidental pun. So I think you're in safe hands from all possible skin-crawling referential humor and bad quotes. No references to there being too much sand here, no somehow the witness returned either. You'll never hear a distant roar before the drifter says, I have a bad feeling about this. For my money, this was a critical part of preserving the balance between the two IPs and making it so that the narrative didn't feel like it was being dragged down by Star Wars influence. And you know what? That's good. What's there from a Star Wars influence should elevate a narrative, should elevate an IP generally. And I think if Bungie had jumped in and just dropped 10 billion Star Wars quotes into this thing, they really wouldn't have done that. Regarding the balance generally, I don't think this was ever something that Bungie was going to get perfectly right. There was a clear effort to try and find where that balance best lay. Not to mention that with something like this, you can't really please everyone. One man's trash heap is going to be another man's gold mine, but you get the idea. There is also another unsaid thing to this, which is that if you're going to have a Star Wars expansion, there might be the temptation to try and cleave authentically to something that's only Destiny. But a Star Wars expansion without blasters and without lightsabers would be kind of bland. Like someone just washed the chocolate off a Kit Kat and left a soggy wafer. I know that the Praxic blade stands out, I know the blasters authentically sound like Star Wars blasters, but they're also fun to use, and they feel like Destiny guns. So ultimately, I don't think the balance is terrible. I think that there are bits which definitely stand out. I'm going to call out the pre-order armor again, but yeah, I think the balance is not bad. If nothing else, this is just another reminder that you shouldn't pre-order things. Moving on, let's talk about the campaign and the narrative. Whilst I didn't get to play all of it, and whilst there were definitely bits and pieces that I had to skip over because of the way that the recording and capture worked, and whilst I can only give some rudimentary opinions on it because of NDAs and embargoes, I will say that what I played of it meets the expectations of a Destiny campaign in this era of the game's history. And that actually means it's doing pretty good. Consider for a second that Final Shape is within this era of the game, and also whilst Edge of Fate was not received well, the one bit that really shone outside of the raid was the narrative, which people consistently praised. So if Renegades is kind of feeling like it's approaching that quality bar from having played just a little bit of it, that's actually a really good place to be. Now, that being said, I think the closest comparison genuinely is Edge of Fate in terms of the narrative's scope and scale. To be really clear though, because I can see some of you typing already, I am talking about narrative in the campaign, and not pure gameplay. I say this because everybody sat there and thought that me saying the campaign of Edge of Fate was good meant that I loved the ball. I don't, and that's not what I meant. For what it's worth, if you are concerned about ball mechanics being a persistent thing in Destiny, or just the puzzly nature of Edge of Fate having bled into other parts of the game, take a deep breath. Not a ball mechanic in sight, no puzzles for the most part. This is just much more traditional as far as a Destiny campaign is concerned, and I think it is better for it. There is no kind of Metroidvania ability set, there is no ball, I swear to God there is no ball. The campaign structure focuses a lot more on what a good Destiny campaign typically does. It's there to take you through a series of locations, tell you a story along the way, introduce you to interesting characters, and to conclude with cool boss fights, I presume. If Renegades does take something good away from Edge of Fate, it's the close contact that you have with all the narrative elements of the story, including the villains. There are also some really high quality cutscenes, be they in-engine, stylized or otherwise, and it continues the streak that they've had since Heresy of having some really awesome cutscene work generally. However, there is one bit in one of the cutscenes that opened up the entire campaign which I can't show, but honestly it kind of sat poorly with me. It's this moment where one of the Cabal characters, Premier Loom, wanders into the Drifter's derelict having just broken in with the Barrent Imperium. It's an imposing image of him as he first comes through the smoke and the mist and starts getting fired upon by all of the frames, and then he just stands way too still. Like he doesn't even flinch at the bullets. I kind of get what they're going for. I feel like this was an attempt to capture the Rogue One Darth Vader scene, where he just completely decimates a bunch of rebel soldiers within a corridor, but honestly, yeah, it would have been so much better if he'd even just slowly turned his head and done just like a little bit of motion. it would have sold the scene entirely for me, but at current it kind of just looks like someone forgot to animate him for a solid 10 seconds, which is a shame really, because the rest of the cutscene is great. It's a small detail, and in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it really matters, but I think it stands out because this is the first time we've met this character, and it falls a little bit flat for me. There are other cutscenes, and as I'm sure you've seen from some of the Renegade previews, things like lightsaber fights, or fights with Praxic blades, I suppose. Yeah, they look fantastic. Talking a little bit more about some of the characters in Renegades, I think all of them follow some interesting directions and dynamics as well. The ensemble cast and crew that the Drifter pulled together for his particular heist this time around is a really interesting one. It includes the like of Eris, which is always a massive plus, but we're also joined by other characters, like Ido and Arnor. They each occupy a sort of classic Star Wars character archetype fittingly enough. Speaking with Allison, she described Eris Morn as occupying a sort of Leia Organa narrative archetype. However, she's not the one being rescued, she's the one doing the rescuing. Allison also described how Ido sort of occupies the Chewbacca archetype, on account of them being the non-human contrasting cast member. But even with those characters, I think you can go deeper, because Eris is a hive god, and she definitely also gives a lot of Witch of Dathomir feel, a little bit like Night Sister Merrin from Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. Meanwhile, Ido fills the role of Chewie, sure, but she's also absolutely an archetypal C-3PO character, with her analytical approach, her earnest nature, and the way that she's genuinely just trying to look out for the good of everyone. The nice part of all of this is that even outside of them filling fairly understandable Star Wars archetypes, these characters are being true to their Destiny selves. Eris is always going to be a badass hive god. Ido was always going to care about the knowledge of everything and to have kind of an earnest attitude. And Arnor was always going to be the archetypal lawful good character, just like she is in the lore. The Drifter was always going to be Han Solo, but too old for this, especially after the events of Edge of Fate. I think by far the most interesting character in the expansion from my quick look is our new antagonist, Dredgen Bale. Oh boy, do I have some things to say about this when the embargo drops. He's really interesting because your impressions of him are going to change and evolve very quickly throughout this campaign, I feel. He starts off with his first appearance seeming like the kind of character that you'd think you'd be understanding and predicting the actions of within the first hour of getting to know him, because it seems like there's a clear vision of him being the predictably confident Sith Lord archetype. He has the gloating voice you'd expect, the superiority, the ferocity, but at the same time he's got something more to him, which is the connection to the world around the Fate Saga, and immediately, as things come along, it becomes very clear that he is less Sith Master and more Sith Apprentice, and this is where his flaws start to come in. By the end of the first campaign mission, you realize that this is not some unstoppable Sith Lord, but a character with weaknesses and flaws, things that can be exploited, things that make him honestly a lot more interesting, things that contextualize some of the crazy things he does, both to others and to himself. That dynamic sets up a lot of big things for the Fate Saga generally, and it adds a lot of dimension to his character. Without going into spoilers, he really quickly develops into his own character, which is kind of unlike a lot of other Star Wars villains that we might have seen, and he is deeply flawed. Alison Lurs described him as having this bottomless pit that can only be filled by approval, and yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely it does. Then he gets to embrace the signature Destiny brand of weird that makes all those things interesting in pursuit of that. And that gets very spicy. Without going too much deeper into it, I think Bale's character is a great foil to some already existing characters in the setting, and we'll see a little of that in the campaign as well. He has plenty of back and forth jabs and banter with other characters, and it means we really get to know him. This is when Destiny villains are actually strong, when we get to care about them, and when they're actually talking to us on a regular basis. That's a good thing. This is not some villain of the week, at least as best as I can tell it doesn't feel like that. So, hopefully, Dredgen Bale is someone who becomes a memorable villain, if only because of the other forces behind him. If you've seen my first story mission, you'll know that Six, a member of the Nine tied to Saturn, is very much involved in this. This is also going to be their story as well as Bale's. I wasn't able to see the full campaign, and therefore I don't know how Bale's story ends by the finishing notes of Renegades, but I think it's safe to say he's going to be one of the more memorable parts of this expansion. So, let's move on from the narrative and talk about activities, namely the Lawless Frontier, which is the main bundle of activities for the expansion, and it's a bit of an interesting thing to try and judge. It's essentially a series of activities set up across a bunch of different destination spaces. The variety they add is relatively impressive, but they also funnel you all into essentially a few subtypes of activity, all under 3 different reputation tracks. If each of these spaces was repurposed into another activity, I think we'd have 3 or 4 relatively coherent strikes on our hands. The activities have a lot more variety than just a strike. It gives me some Nether vibes, but also some Menagerie vibes as well. Granted, it's not a 6-person activity, it's only a 3-person activity. Not to mention that extracting from the end of each mission is an interesting touch. It's more Helldivers than, say, an extraction shooter like Ark Raiders, but yeah, it's still an interesting one, and for the first time in Destiny history, you actually get to use the guns on a Hawk gunship. Which, yeah, I guess that's kind of neat. Within each of these major destinations, I think there's 3 to 5 different areas within each of them, and within each of those areas you will have to complete various tasks as you go through your Lawless Frontier missions. Enemy density within the activity is really quite good, especially on the higher difficulties. You can see probably in the gameplay, but there are some moments where there's more laser fire on my screen than I can possibly walk away from. There's something like 3 or 4 mission types, multiple sub-objectives in each one, and there's also a lot of variety to be had run by run. However, there is also an interesting extra component to this, which is the PvE-VP component, which is an opt-in situation. If you never want to face another player within the Lawless Frontier, you don't need to. So rejoice if you're the kind of person who wanted to play Gambit for the loot but absolutely hated the moment that you heard the invasion klaxon. With that in mind, I don't think that invading is actually too terrible of a thing within this. It doesn't ruin the experience. And it's actually something which means that I think taking the risk for it is completely reasonable. You're likely to get a single invader with each round, but unlike Gambit, you're not in a race versus an entire enemy team to accomplish your objectives first. This isn't in a set arena of a specific size, and the spawns, well, they can drop you on the other side of the map where there are no lines of sight. So if you've been playing Gambit for years and you know that there were some teams that would just immediately set up on sightlines with one-hit kill weapons, yeah, that's not going to happen. Equally, the invader needs to get a certain number of kills to succeed, but if you die to them, your run isn't completely ended. You can continue on and still get out with all the possible loot you need. Both the invader and the defender can succeed in their objectives, and it takes a pretty catastrophic invader timing for the defenders to actually lose their max rewards. Even if you don't finish, you still get your completion rewards. You just don't get the bonuses. I hazard to say this is how it should be. I got invaded by a pretty good player, aka Pure Chill, while I was playing this with Mr. Fruit, while we were at the capture event. And normally when I'd see that, if it was in a Gambit context, I would be quaking in my boots. You know, this time it was kind of fine. We died multiple times, Pure Chill got out with their successful invasion, and ultimately, yeah, it was all okay. Also, I've got to throw the tiniest bit of shade because I killed Pure Chill with a lightsaber throw to the void. This is literally my entire Destiny PvP career having peaked in this moment. I will never get a higher high than this. Sorry, I just had to say it. The balance seems fine with invasions is the point I'm trying to make. It doesn't feel like if you're going to get stumped by an absolutely godly invader that you're going to lose all your stuff and then fail the mission. If anything, a top tier invader will get in more quickly and accomplish their objectives just as fast, leaving you with more time to complete yours. The key is again that both you and the invader can still be victorious. There is a relatively large question to be asked about the nature and longevity of the Lawless Frontier as a whole though. After all, this is just like any other activity from any other season. It has variety to it for certain, and there's a pretty wide loot pool that can drop from it, but it'll all be a question of how long it holds people's attention for as per usual. Yet again, we ask the age-old question of, is there enough meat on the bones of this Destiny expansion? And in this instance, I fear that this is not necessarily going to be something that occupies people's time for much longer than a month or so. Now sure, a new dungeon and all of the secrets that inevitably come along with it are going to be a good thing to also get with the expansion, and there are other elements to Renegades that we're going to get to experience, but I think that there is something more to this question. Even with the new things that are added into the Lawless Frontier, and the fact that it has 3 separate progression tracks, we still have yet to see if this is going to last us all the way until Shadow and Order, or Shattered Cycle beyond that. Whether that's possible is an open question, but it's the thing that really troubles me for the moment. The Lawless Frontier is thematic and fun, but it's nothing revolutionary for Destiny. It's kind of hard to innovate on how do you shoot and kill guys for the 50th different activity, and ultimately a lot of it is going to fall in that same kind of seasonal activity pace that people probably know by now. Now, there are some new things they've added with this. In particular, the Renegade abilities stand out. They are a ton of fun and I don't regret their addition, but I have to echo a point made by fellow creator LlamaD2, which is that instead of getting Renegade abilities that will only ever see play within a single activity, I'd much rather see permanent sandbox additions, such as more aspects and fragments for subclasses that lack them, or heck, whole new subclasses entirely. That being said, there is a little bit of joy to be found with the Renegade abilities because of the fact that they're only used within the Lawless Frontier, and that means they can be wildly imbalanced because, well, they're only impacting that single activity. For example, the Cabal drop pod, even if it doesn't kill anything that it lands on, also dumps out a bunch of ammo at its max tier, which makes it a ridiculously powerful tool for restocking your team, as well as a cathartic means of vengeance that we've needed for almost a decade now. Speaking of sandbox additions, and moving on from the Lawless Frontier onto something else, I think we absolutely also need to talk about the new blaster archetypes of weapons. Now, to be really clear, this is not a single subfamily of gun, like the spread-shot hand cannon, or the heavy burst pulse rifle, or heavy burst sidearms, or rocket pulses. Blasters come with 2 new intrinsic perk types, Balanced and Dynamic. Both weapons use a new system of heat, which is something, granted, that we've seen before displayed through ammunition, but it's now done with a percentage meter, and is a lot more tangible. With Dynamic Blasters, if you hit reload at the very end of the vent as you hit that white bar on the left side of the reload, you'll be able to engage dynamic heat sinks, and that's going to allow you to fire the weapon for even longer as you continue to fire it from that point onwards. It only lasts for a few seconds, but on a weapon like a sniper rifle, that can be a really big deal, because that can be a seriously large amount of DPS before you need to reload or vent the weapon, as it is with blasters. Balanced blasters work like your classic perfect vent kind of weapon. You get the weapon up to 90% heat generated, and vent ahead of hitting 100%. At 100% you overheat, but at 90%, that's when you get perfect venting, which is much faster, allows you to get back in the action more quickly, and also has a nice sound to it. In fact, they both have a nice sound to them. The other thing to note is that blasters are not like another archetype of weapon like, say, a machine gun or a pulse rifle. They can be many types of archetype of weapon. They are just intrinsic perks that change the behavior of the gun entirely. You can have blasters that are machine guns, pulse rifles, sidearms, hand cannons, snipers, auto rifles. Honestly, there's a ton of weapons that can have this blaster archetype, and all of them don't just have this interesting new venting mechanic. They also have the authentic Star Wars feel to them, but it also represents a pretty substantial addition to the game, even without the Star Wars coat of paint on it. It's nothing revolutionary, but it is a big addition because these weapons can actually change pretty dramatically because of that venting technique that's being used. It's effectively like saying, hey, sustained DPS goes up because you can use dynamic heat sinks to get 5 rounds out of this sniper instead of 3, or alternatively, it's a way of saying, if I'm going on a tear and I'm really good with my timing, I can get an even faster reload that's kind of akin to something like Outlaw by default on the weapon. Normally, a heat kind of archetype in a game just doesn't feel that good, but in this instance, if you learn them properly and are able to actually use the dynamic and balanced traits to your advantage, it feels like you've got an extra perk on there that's specifically designed around reloads and magazine size. In that sense, their addition to the game feels pretty substantial in a way that I haven't felt since the addition of something like bows or glaives. It's not just some sub-archetype of a weapon we already see, like a rocket sidearm or rocket pulse, it's an entirely new weapon with a weird way of existing within the game. In fact, it's not just one weapon archetype, it's a ton of weapon archetypes. And that's before you throw in a ton of different perks, including some bespoke ones that are only available for these heatsink weapons. They're a really interesting addition to the sandbox, but they are not what was the highlight of the expansion and my time with it. The Praxic Blade, aka the lightsaber. To be really clear, something that pains me is that I'm not allowed to say a lot about this. I honestly wish I could gush about how cool this thing is. It was such a hyperfixation that I had a build video that I was writing on the way back from Bungie, and then I realized that I wasn't allowed to share any of the details because that's something that they want you to find all the way on your own. What I can tell you is that there is a ton of depth to be found here. In fact, there is a whole lot more than meets the eye. It's a sword archetype in game, of course, but it does everything you'd expect a lightsaber to do, including deflecting projectiles shot in your direction, having its charged melee attack being a thrown attack where it throws the lightsaber and then returns to your hand when commanded. It also has its own animation set, which looks fantastic and contains a lot of the martial arts stylings that lightsaber combat is known for. If you asked me to tell you what form this is, I probably couldn't say, but if someone told me that this was inspired by one of the main lightsaber forms in Star Wars, I wouldn't be surprised. Just don't ask me if this is Shicho or Makashi or something, I won't be able to tell you. Something I do wish is that the lightsaber had a few more animation sets that could go with it. That's also asking a lot, and honestly, it's something that we don't see with any other kind of weapon in Destiny, so that's a lot of time being poured into a single exotic. Blocking with the Praxic Blade activates the deflection mode, and it has its own animation too. As you'd expect, it also reflects enemy fire back at wherever you're aiming, which ended up being my favorite way to use it, which was the biggest surprise of my entire time playing Renegades, because, I mean, I don't play Hunter, but I know Blight Ranger exists, and, well, yeah, it has not instilled confidence in us over the last few years. If you're someone who's always wanted the Arc Hunter's staff to actually be a reasonable tool for reflecting damage, you finally have a home with the Praxic Blade. It feels like it's an actual component to the weapon, and not just an afterthought. You also have a neat melee attack combo that you can loop with the weapon. 3 light attacks followed by a heavy attack foregoes the saber being thrown in favor of this big overhead AoE ground slam that does pretty substantial damage to everything in the local area. It also costs no ammo to use it like this, so you're actually incentivized to make this longer combo work. And of course, there are a bunch of different colors to the lightsaber. There's a lot of customization to be had generally, but I think that's all that I'm mostly allowed to say. I'm not a build crafting channel, but again, for what it's worth, while I was going back on the plane, I wanted to make a video about build crafting for the Praxic Blade, because if you're looking for depth with lightsabers, yeah, I think that you've got it here. It's also got the authentic sounds and acts authentically like a lightsaber, but there is just one little bit of jank to it. About 95% of the time it acts as you'd want it to, but then you throw the thing and it can get a little bit complicated. For one, you've just thrown your weapon, and as a result you're standing there with nothing in your hands while it's out there on the field causing mayhem. This is the moment when you're at your most vulnerable, as you can't deflect and your only option is really to switch to another weapon or to recall the saber, which can take time. I recommend doing this while in cover to avoid as much of the enemy fire as possible. The other jank thing that I noticed about this happened when I was throwing my saber while jumping above the enemy. Most of the time when you throw a lightsaber or a Praxic Blade, it tracks to your opponent and then does damage and then returns to you. However, if you're jumping, sometimes when you throw the blade, it will be locked in behind the enemy and will hit nothing. And that means that you're in the air with no weapon to block with, just kind of standing there defenseless. It only happened about 5% of the time, but that 5% was noticeable, and it does mean that the way that you play using a lightsaber playstyle is going to be impacted somewhat. I did put notes on this in my feedback to Bungie, so it's not impossible that this is something that they've tweaked up ahead of the expansion being released, but you'll be able to tell pretty quickly if it's tracking as it should. This didn't happen for the vast majority of the time, and it was fairly easy to recover from, but in both instances, quirks or bugs like these I think are worth being aware of. As I said before, there is so much more to talk about with the Praxic Blade. I mean, just so much, but I'm NDA'd on all of it, and you guys are going to find out if you jump into Renegades for yourself. I know that there are many aspects of the expansion that people are skeptical of, The lightsaber is cool. Praxic blades are really awesome. All I really could possibly ask for are for the bugs to be fixed, and the big ask of extra animation sets being added in so that there are different styles of melee combat with lightsabers. That would make this truly perfect. Again, that last thing is a big ask, and I don't think it's going to happen, but hey, it's out there now. And if you agree, maybe you'll say so when you play it for yourself. If enough of us say it, maybe Bungie will do it. I don't know, they made the Monte Carlo actually stab people after however many years, so these things do happen. Alongside Renegades, there are a spattering of new activity options that have been added to the game, and lots of those come in the form of more portal nodes. And to be honest, I completely understand if this doesn't move the needle for, like, anyone. Frankly, it doesn't for me. They added Arena Ops, which is a place where you can replay old 6-player activities, such as the Haunted Leviathan from the Season of the Haunted, or Astral Alignment from Season of the Lost. It's good to have these old seasonal activities back, but they don't have the sheen of new content, and their attractiveness is very much going to be tied to the focused loot available for them. Also, as I'm sure many people feeding on the steady drip of nostalgia will say, it doesn't look like Menagerie is returning in this first iteration of things. Solo Ops is getting a new edition with a mission where you go inside the Typhon Imperator, Callus's ship that's perpetually parked within Neomuna over on Neptune. Fireteam Ops is seeing the return of the Sunless Cell. These are fine, but honestly, if you know what you like and dislike about the Portal, none of that has fundamentally changed in Renegades. Except for one really important factor, which is this. Whilst yes, you can get some of the new loot from the Portal, a lot of it is going to drop from the Lawless Frontier instead. As best I know, leveling can also be achieved entirely through the Lawless Frontier. So if you want to level up, you can do it just by playing the new content. You are not being forced into playing old content to go beyond the soft cap. It seems like the major feedback around the Portal has also been heard loud and clear, and whilst new stuff is going to be added to it, I think the priority of it is going to be pushed way back, and I imagine that's going to continue going forward. However, don't expect it to be completely phased out at any point in the near future. Game development is a slow process, and it takes time to move and react on these things. As I said at the top of the video, the pace sometimes feels glacial for us players. As a result, the fact that this change is happening now is good, but also the Portal still exists, and the same problems with it may still exist, except for the larger leveling one that prevented people from enjoying new content in a new expansion. As best I can tell, the role of the Portal is going to be changing in the future to become an avenue for where old content can still be played and still be kept relevant. However, all of the things that we all know and hate about the Portal, they still remain. And honestly, we've seen so many of the recent twids and blog posts about how they're changing things and how the Portal was a mistake, so I'm going to stop beating that particular dead horse. Trust me, they're aware. If the Portal continues on its path to becoming a repository for us to see old content still be relevant, cool, great, I love that you can level from it, but you shouldn't need to level from it. It needs to be thoroughly in the back seat compared to the main activities of the expansion, and I think Bungie knows that by now. So that's all the bits and pieces I played in Renegades and the bits that I got impressions of. Overall, I was impressed with my time in Renegades, but for some I know that that's just not going to move the needle. Bungie knows that there's a lot of damage to trust, and I told them as much in my time playing at the studio. When I voiced to people in the playtest lab the term trust deficit to describe the sentiment of the community, yeah, there were no disagreements heard. Everyone knows that they don't just have negative trust or zero trust, they are in the place where they have trust debt. However, I think there is a little bit of a silver lining to this. If you're going to jump in, I think you can count on the story being worth engaging with, and the Rad team rarely lets us down with raids or dungeons, so I think it's likely that we'll see some hype around that. In addition, I think I need to point this out. There are some moments where there have been flops, needless to say. Ashen Iron is a blight on the narrative team's reputation, but other than that, when it comes to major expansions, there's a pattern that's developing. Final Shape, Edge of Fate. 2 expansions back-to-back that have basically been some of the biggest Destiny expansions in terms of their narrative reception. They have performed really well. Something that no one was really criticizing about Edge of Fate was the story, which, honestly, that sets a really interesting precedent. There is a world where Renegades actually has a good story as well, and if that's the case, Suddenly, Destiny has a pattern that's developed, where it's actually releasing campaigns with solid narratives. I do certainly hope that this is something that continues, and I can't make that judgment yet because it's too soon, but watch that space, it's not impossible. In addition, if the Raid and Dungeon team continues to wow us as they so regularly do, I think that we are likely to see a little bit of hype around Equilibrium, the new dungeon that's going to be launching with Renegades. And of course, there is something more to this, which can be both a benefit and a downside to it depending on how you see it, which is the Star Wars aspect of this expansion. If you really love Star Wars, I think this is going to be for you. However, if you don't love Star Wars, I also would understand if this would be a hard pass. The biggest question still remains the same as it's always been. How do we solve content droughts in a game, and how do we create real longevity with what's being given to players? Renegades, I think, is going to make some stabs in the direction of solving some of that, but it's also not going to find any concrete answers. This expansion is going to be a lot of things to a lot of people, some good, some bad. But most of all, personally, I hope people just have fun with it. That, and I hope that this starts a trend line of improvement for Bungie, which we sorely need right now. If they can continue to make a pattern out of releasing good bits of content, and if they can just replicate that pattern, maybe we dig ourselves out of this mess. Delivering on things for the rest of the game and showing the community that they've really turned the page is going to be the big challenge for Bungie, I think. It's hard to tell if Renegades is the first step towards that turn, but I think it's not impossible. As a many-year-old skill-up video once said though, the Yara Viking is a massive ship and it takes a long time just for it to make a simple turn and correct its course. So yeah, here we are again. Surprising perhaps nobody, and yet also seemingly surprising at least a few people every time, game development isn't something that just turns on a dime. We'll have to wait and see what the reception to Renegades really is, and we'll have to wait and see what happens afterwards as we move towards Shadow and Order, and of course the next few expansions, Shattered Cycle and The Alchemist. For now though, that's all from me. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, go ahead and leave your thoughts down below in the comments section, and remember to leave a like. But of course know that as per usual, your viewership as always has been quite enough for me, and that in the meantime my name is Byf. Perodacia ad Astra. I'll see you, Starside.